Hi everybody, my name is Ian Roach and I'm an Associate Director of URS with a responsibility for environment and planning in South West England. I'm going to speak to you today about some recent research I undertook examining public understanding of the environmental effects of an energy from waste facility, or EFW facility, in Plymouth. The full research was published last year in a journal called Impact Assessment and Project Appraisal, but what I present today is a summary. A number of noteworthy disparities were identified between public perceptions of environmental effects and the results of the EIA, and I hope it's useful to bring these to the attention of EIA practitioners to enable us to better appreciate specific areas of public concern and to consider ways in which we might improve environmental statements to facilitate public understanding. Some of the findings can be applied to EIAs for lots of different types of development, not just EFW facilities. Waste management company MVV has planning permission for an EFW facility at Devonport in Plymouth. The facility will treat up to 265,000 tonnes of residual waste per year after its opening at the end of this year, 2014. Waste will be combusted and the heat used to generate steam, which will drive a turbine which will generate electricity. But importantly, the site's location will also allow steam to be fed into the existing Devonport Dockyard and Naval Base heating network. This is largely why the site was chosen, to enable recovery of heat as well as power, which is much more efficient and sustainable. However, the site is also close to residential property, which increases the potential effects of a number of the environmental impacts associated with this type of development. As you would expect, the project was subject to an environmental impact assessment, and throughout the planning process, MVV and URS engaged extensively with the community. It's fair to say that there was some sizable opposition to the proposals. However, planning permission was granted in February 2012, and the facility is currently under construction. I led the team of consultants which prepared the environmental statement, and I think it's important that as practitioners we sometimes look back at our work and reflect upon it. The published literature shows that there have been public concerns about the environmental and health effects of EFW facilities, and that it is important to appreciate the different ways in which these effects and the risk of their occurrence are perceived and understood by members of the public. Through examination of the Plymouth case study, the purposes of my research were therefore to enable a greater understanding of the public's concerns and to identify any common misunderstandings or differences in value judgments so that communication in future environmental statements can be improved. The research methodology was relatively simple but very time-consuming and involved reading and analysing each of the 616 letters of objection sent to the Waste Planning Authority. The environmental statement was highly detailed and comprised 4 volumes of material. The photograph here shows the full planning application package including the environmental statement. In summary, the environmental statement robustly concluded that the majority of the environmental effects would actually not be significant. It identified some significant adverse effects on visual amenity for a limited number of local viewpoints, but concluded that high-quality architectural design and comprehensive landscaping were sufficient to overcome them. The environmental statement also found that whilst construction noise would likely cause some short-term localized significant adverse effects, acoustic barriers would reduce effects to low or negligible significance. So, from an EIA practitioner's perspective, the main issues were landscape and visual effects and construction noise. As we will come on to see, the concerns of the members of the public were quite different. Emissions from EFW facilities are subject to very strict regulation by the Environment Agency, enforcing European and domestic legislation set for the protection of the environment and public health. Taking into account the gas, scrubbing, particulate filters and other mitigation measures built into the facility, the dispersion modelling showed that the maximum concentrations of each of the pollutants would be well within the required criteria. using the industry standard methodologies that will be familiar to most of you, the overall effects were classified as being negligible. However, as you might expect, there was considerable public concern about potential adverse health effects, something which was expressed in over 100 objection letters. But it's not as simple as we say one thing and they say the opposite. I needed to examine this in more detail. For example, I found a noteworthy misunderstanding in respect of the chimney height. Several people queried why, if the health effects were quoted as not being significant, was there a need for such a tall chimney, which by the way is 95 meters tall. Some people were concerned that since their properties were at the same elevation as the top of the chimney, albeit distant from it, they would be directly exposed to pollution. Some people were concerned that the higher the chimney, the wider the area polluted, and some were concerned that every person living within the 12-mile study area, which was shown on the modelling plots, would be threatened. Now, although gases are subject to stringent cleaning, there are limits to the technology, so the function of the high chimney is to disperse the remaining pollutants over a wider area, and thereby reducing their ground level concentrations. There was therefore a considerable disparity between the conclusions of the air quality and health assessment and the concerns of the public. I think the future challenge for EIA practitioners will be to find novel and concise ways of better communicating results of air quality assessments, possibly through the use of animation. The closest residential properties are just 60 meters from the main building. As you would expect, software was used to model the facility and surroundings in 3D and calculate the noise levels at nearby properties. The facility was designed to minimize and mitigate noise as far as possible. The noise levels were calculated to not exceed 5 decibels above background levels, and using standard methodologies, the environmental statement concluded that the effects would be classified as low or in some cases negligible, depending on the location of the receptor. Residents' concerns about noise turned out to be very nuanced. Lots of people expressed concerns about the nature of the noise, not just its decibel level. Concerns often focused on the 24-hour nature of the noise. A few people even got the idea that the plant would sound like a, and I quote, high-pitched mosquito. There was also general uncertainty about what the maximum increase of 5 decibels would actually mean. In other words, how do decibels relate to real life? I've learned that I need to be more mindful of these nuances or similar ones in future projects, and I urge others to do the same. And as with air quality, I'd also suggest that more novel approaches to demonstrating noise impacts are required, such as perhaps sound recordings of noise from similar facilities being played at public exhibitions or on the internet, although these would have limitations and would require careful setup and delivery. One example is something called Sound Lab, which is a virtual listening booth developed by consultants Arup that's been used during public exhibitions for the proposed High-Speed 2 rail project. Road traffic was of concern to a large number of people. Many correspondents expressed the sentiment that roads and junctions had reached their capacity already, and that adding any further traffic would be a problem. Concerns were also expressed about increased wear and tear on roads and about increased risk of accidents. Concerns about noise related not only to engine noise but also to reversing alarms, horns, over-revving. Air quality concerns tended to focus on health risks, but CO2 emissions and climate change were also mentioned a lot in the letters. The location of a primary school adjacent to the facility's main access route was a particular concern, of course. Here are some examples of what people said, which I'll leave up on the screen for a short while. Again, people's concerns were considerably different from the conclusions in the environmental statement, which were reached using industry standard methodologies that you'll be familiar with. The increases in traffic volumes were predicted to be between 0.1 and 8.6%, depending on the road length. and within the capacities of the highways and junctions. The environmental statement classified the effects of these increases to be negligible. It also analysed accident data and found that there are no trends in causality or clustering of accidents on those roads. The existing nitrogen dioxide concentration was measured next to the school as being 30.6 micrograms per cubic metre. And the predicted increase from the EFW facility is 1.3 micrograms. Considered against the European Union air quality limit value of 40 micrograms, the effect was classified as negligible. Traffic noise near the school was predicted to increase from 69.7 decibels to 70.0, a very small increase of 0.3 decibels, and therefore classified as negligible. These examples reiterate how important it is to summarise impact assessments in the context of baseline conditions. And again, I think we as EIA practitioners need to be even more mindful of people's opinions, and in particular the way that we perceive the significance of effects very much differently than they do. I even think we should consider how we can build this into our assessments in some way, without of course compromising ours and our developer clients' positions. Potential impacts of the EFW facility with other existing and proposed major developments were of concern to 82 people. One person wrote, and I quote, "to protest at the prospective addition of yet another environmentally unfriendly scheme to an already burdened part of Plymouth." This slide shows the major existing developments that were considered in the EIA. All of these were mentioned in the letters, with the concern being that there would be combined effects with the EFW facility, which is a very fair concern. For example, there's a naval base and dockyard with nuclear submarines, there's an armaments depot, a sewage works, a hospital incinerator. The existing developments shown on the plan were explicitly accounted for in our assessment, but as part of the baseline, because they already exist. This is distinct from consented or potential future developments with which there could be effects, which were assessed in our cumulative effects assessment, as shown here. But the evidence that I gathered suggests that, as far as members of the public are concerned, distinguishing between baseline and cumulative developments is absolutely moot. None of the consented or potential future developments were mentioned in the letters, and no one at all used the term cumulative effects. What people were much more concerned about was existing developments, believing that their environment, and mainly in this case their roads, were at or already exceeding their capacity. Of all the 82 comments on this topic, the phrase "the straw that broke the camel's back" most succinctly makes the point. What I take away from these findings is that we need to remind members of the public, in an informative but of course not patronising way, of the presence of existing developments and make clear their contribution to baseline conditions and the way in which they've been treated in the EIA. Annotated mapping is a simple suggestion for achieving that. It's worth mentioning that the environmental statement also assessed ecology, landscape, cultural heritage, land and water quality, flood risk, construction waste and socio-economic effects, but no significant differences in value judgments, misunderstandings or unexpected concerns were identified for those topics. So to summarise, the research identified substantial differences between the conclusions of the environmental statement and concerns of the public. I certainly think that as well as focusing on getting the technical assessments right, we need to better understand what people are concerned about and try to respond to that. We should be examining very carefully the way in which the information in our environmental statements, and in particular our non-technical summaries, is presented. It would appear, I dare say, that non-technical summaries are not as extensively read as we might like to think. And if that's true, then we need to think differently about making our NTSs more widely available and accessible. And it's not just about the NTS, but also our contributions to newsletters, websites and exhibition materials which stem from them, and social media, because those are the modes by which people most engage with development projects. Thank you very much for listening.